Hello, today we're going over chapter 35. Here's question 1. So, we just use the formula to calculate the inflation rate. Uh, for part A, it's 9%. And here, the vector V decreases by, uh, it decreases by 3%, so inflation also decreases by 3%. And real growth is not really affected because inflation does all the adjustment in this case. You do the same thing for each country or each nation. You have 4% inflation rate. Here the V increases 4%, so inflation rises to 8%, and the real growth stays the same. Here inflation is 0% because the left side and right side to be balanced. And here in the M vector or the M value is decreasing by 2%, so it's going to 1%. So inflation decreases to -2% and real growth stays at 3%. Question 2, we first had to indicate where the high aggregate demand real growth and the high aggregate inflation would be. And is seen by this orange line, which is drawn, which would be the increase that's caused from this scenario. Part B, when the person does their job right, the orange line would shift back to the original position to this blue line here, and the inflation rate would be at 10% at the slow run aggregate supply. Question 3, we see this new short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply curves shifting to the right, and the inflation rate is lower and the real growth is higher. As you can see, it goes from there to there, so that's lower inflation and higher growth rate. And then in order for the inflation to return to the old level, the central bank should raise money, so it shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. So this is going to be shifted to the right, so inflation would increase. And in this case, we need to lower the real supply, so we need to decrease the aggregate demand. And this is the cruel trade-off which economists talk about, because you can't really do both at the same time. If you increase one of them, the other would decrease, and if you decrease one of them, the other.
Chapter 35, Lab 21. The question 4 asked, identify which of the following so-called rules are like rules and which are more like discretion. What is the difference between regulated and discretionary decision-making? So these examples include Congress passing a law providing automatic cost of living increases every year. Congress follows the rules of vote every few years on how much to increase Social Security payments. The Federal Reserve follows the famous Taylor rule for setting the federal funds rate, which is a specific rule for raising federal funds. The Federal Reserve follows the rule of doing whatever seems right at the time. The police follow a rule of questioning anyone loitering outside of a bank who looks suspicious, and the police follow a line of questioning anyone loitering outside a bank who is dressed in bulky clothing that could conceal a weapon. So first we have to talk about what the difference between discretionary and regulatory decision making is. So essentially this difference comes down to rules are consistent regulations that an entity must follow. So when there's regulatory decision making, the Fed or police officers or Congress must follow specific rules that they must abide by, whereas discretionary decision making is adjusted willy-nilly based off the circumstances that are surrounding them. So that it's very open to personal interpretation. So the first one is an example of a legislative rule because it happens every single year. But the second is B is legislative discretion because it's open to politicizing Social Security. C is an economic rule because it's a specific equation, a specific rate that they must follow, whereas just doing whatever the Fed wants can lead to inconsistent policy making and mistakes with economic discretion. E is discretionary jurisdiction, so essentially these officers are essentially making decisions purely based off of their own interpretation of the events. Instead of F, where there's regulatory jurisdiction, where the police are constrained by certain regulations, that they can only approach these people who meet the certain criteria instead of just meeting people who they think look sketchy. So this is the difference. Question 5 asks to graphically depict a situation where consumer pessimism over-exaggerates the effects of the economic shock. It asks to plot the aggregate demand curve's reaction to the real and false shock, and it asks to plot the shift of the aggregate demand curve in response to a central bank's reactive monetary policy. Also, it asked, how did the exaggerated news affect the final state of the economy? We can look, and to our left is an aggregate demand response to real and false shock. So we can see the aggregate demand true is only an aggregate demand shock of 5%, so it decreased 5%. And we can see the false consumer pessimism said that it decreased all the way to 10%. So then we can see in the response to this through monetary policy, by raising it by 10%, it should reach a level of equilibrium. However, because the effects were exaggerated, the response has shifted the aggregate demand curve to a higher state of real GDP growth. However, this has also resulted in a higher inflation rate. Now, this growth rate is not sustainable because it's not consistent with the long run aggregate supply curve. But the inflation rate will be hard to decrease through a deflation policy, so this economy will find itself in a very difficult position as influenced by over-exaggerated consumer pessimism and over-exaggerated monetary policy. So we can see from these two graphs, the aggregate demand true and false curves. Yes. Thank you. I really hope you enjoyed this lab, and I really hope you learned something.
In question number 6, with maintaining market confidence, the Fed could promise to increase the growth rate of money in the economy if things get even worse to help enforce people's confidence in the market. With question number 6, in this circumstance, with the 6 episodes that have happened with this theory, the Fed's theory has worked every single time. Every single time. And with question number 8, which is just my favorite algebra problems, the money market supply grew by 13%. And this one, the money supply grew by 7%. And then you do just a little bit of algebra here. And presto, you figure out that the real growth rate was 0% and inflation was 7%.
So question 9 asks to reenact the Volcker disinflation, but with more flexible wages and workers willing to accept slower growing wages. So part 8 asks to answer part C of the previous question again, but with a steeper SRAS. So in this question, we have to calculate inflation and real growth, which are calculated combining the two equations shown above. So doing this, the real growth is 1% and inflation is 6%. So question B is the same as question A, except with a 100 in place of the 2, making a steeper SRAS. So real growth is about 3% and inflation is therefore 4%. So part C, if you are a central banker trying to cut inflation and you want to keep real growth close to the potential growth rate, you would prefer a steep SRAS as seen in the previous 2 parts because this caused the inflation to be lower and real growth to be closer to potential growth. Question 10 asks, in which of the following cases which changes can we confidently predict? So part A, the banking system becomes less efficient at building bridges between savers and borrowers, and investor confidence declines. A negative real shock and negative velocity shock occur. So this would be the first graph on the left. The negative real shock alone would cause an increase in inflation and decrease in real growth as it shifts the LRAS to the left. And the negative velocity shock would decrease inflation and decrease real growth as it would shift the aggregate demand curve down. So this would together cause a fall in real growth. In part B, the banking system becomes less efficient at building bridges between savers and borrowers, and the Federal Reserve increases money growth. So a negative real shock and positive money shock occur. So this is the second graph, and again, the negative real shock would push the LRAS to the left, increasing inflation and decreasing real growth. However, the positive money shock would increase the aggregate demand curve, so it would increase inflation and increase real growth. So therefore, there would be a rise in inflation with both of those together. In part C, biologists learn how to use computer simulations to rapidly search for molecules that would make promising medicines, and investors become optimistic about future profit opportunities. So there is a positive real shock and a positive velocity shock. So the positive real shock would shift the LRAS to the right, decreasing inflation and increasing real growth. However, the positive velocity shock would shift the aggregate demand up and to the right, therefore increasing inflation and decreasing real growth. So together there would be a definite rise in real growth.